I'm a neuroscientist, and so I study cellular and molecular neuroscience, physiology, and I got into this field not to study marijuana per se. I didn't go to grad school to study marijuana, but I was interested in the neural systems of learning and memory and how cells in the brain, neurons, rearrange their connections, the strength of connections from one brain area to the next. It's something we refer to as neuroplasticity, and it's really central to talking about how learning and memory works, but also how nervous systems regenerate, how they have resilience throughout life. And I was kind of in the right place in the right time to be privy to some of the early discoveries of endocannabinoids and cannabinoid receptors. And really, the reasons that cannabis works as medicine has to be understood in the framework of our body's natural endocannabinoid system. The receptors we have, the signaling pathways, the modes of communication that cells use with these endocannabinoids are a system of homeostasis and well-being and resilience. So I think that any physiologist, any physician is familiar with the term homeostasis, and it refers to a living being's ability to stay within a range of function that's adaptive for life, whether it's keeping your heart rate at a steady rate, your body temperature, your other kinds of physiological set points, blood glucose, but also in the brain there's homeostasis to sort of keep everything working in balance. And the endocannabinoids, turns out, are a really important key player throughout the nervous and immune and endocrine systems. They help to regulate hormone levels. They help to regulate neural systems working in what we would think would be sort of optimal ranges. So the endocannabinoids are molecules that get released by neurons when they're activated. It's really easy to think about this in terms of epilepsy or seizure-related excitotoxicity. Cells in the brain communicate with neurotransmitters that activate the next cell. That's sort of the excitatory transmission. But too much of the signal, the currency of the brain, too much of it is toxic. Endocannabinoids are a way that cells within a circuit tone down their own inputs. They fine-tune their own inputs in order to achieve the most, the best functionality, the ability of the neural circuit to respond to situations. So it turns out things like resilience to stress and modes of learning and memory and other systems of neuroprotection involve cells releasing these endocannabinoids and acting at cannabinoid receptors. And the cannabis plant has evolved in its own way this suite of molecules that also works on those same receptors. And so when we learn, as modern science is learning things about how the endocannabinoid system is protective, helps to impart homeostasis and resilience to neural systems and other tissues, the phytocannabinoids play into that. The plant-based medicine is working with the same systems and should be viewed in that way, rather from the institutional bias that just assumes the plant is causing damage. I think our assumption should be the plant is helping to restore balance when taken medicinally. And sometimes in the case of extreme imbalance, like cancers. Homeostasis is just the way physiology works. And an endocannabinoid description of homeostasis is not complete. It's not the only system that helps to promote well-being. But the ways in which cells, there's something unique about the endocannabinoids as so far as we've discovered. The way a given cell releases endocannabinoids to fine-tune its own inputs, a whole set of inputs, is not like other neurotransmitter systems. Other transmitters like dopamine and serotonin and norepinephrine, there are cells that create them and send projections into the brain and say, we're going to change the way the cerebral cortex works by releasing neurotransmitter. The endocannabinoids are an intrinsic system. Maybe every cell in the brain uses them to fine-tune its own inputs and communicate with its neighbors as to how much signal they should be receiving. The immune system that widely expresses CB2 receptors in very important cells functions in some very analogous ways. CB2 receptors, when they're activated by endocannabinoids, regulate the release of sort of pro-inflammatory mediators. So a really important aspect of the immune system is enhancing inflammation, which creates pain sensitivity. Other aspects of the immune system, like cytotoxic T cells, natural killer cells, target viral infected cells or cells that have become cancerous. For reasons that we don't really understand, so-called transformed cells, cells that have become cancerous, some of them seem to start upregulating the CB2 receptor. A lot of things happen in cancer cells that aren't normal. Their cell cycle is all going out of whack. They start to express genes that they don't normally. And the CB2 receptor seems to be turned on in a lot of tumors. And now an endocannabinoid signal, or a plant cannabinoid signal, depending, there's speculation there in some ways, but an endocannabinoid signal that's neuroprotective or helps to dampen inflammation in the healthy situation, when it acts on these receptors that are being expressed by cancerous cells, it initiates a suicide program. The cell goes into programmed cell death. It becomes a cell death signal in the tumor, a signal that's used to promote well-being and survival and even the growth of new neurons, for example. That same signal or family of molecules seems to act on tumors to help promote cell death. I mean, how effective it'll be in different states of actual cancer is complex. Cancer is not just one disease. People shouldn't run blindly into it. But the amount of preclinical work, animal work, cell culture work with cancer, and patient stories, compelling patient survival stories that are emerging, it just paints such a fascinating picture of, for whatever reason, cancer cells start to respond to the cannabinoids in a way that it causes them to die or regress. And the unifying theme, it seems like, is the holistic theme, the health of the whole animal. The endocannabinoid system really is a very integrative system of homeostasis that seems to act on just about every physiological system we know to promote the well-being of the whole organism, even though the specific effects are diverse, whether it's blocking a hormone here, turning down excitotoxicity there, or recognizing a cancer cell, whether there's recognition or not, acting upon a cancer cell and initiating termination. It's fascinating. It's really fascinating. It is relatively new. I mean, the use of cannabis as medicine is quite old, but as a modern science, it's really lagged behind. And I come into this field as really a drug addiction researcher and somebody interested in neural systems that are related to habit formation, which is not just drug addiction. Tic disorders of unwanted habits like Tourette syndrome, obsessive compulsive disorder, they have more similarity to drug addiction than people realize, because they're all conceptualized as disorders of unwanted habits, whether it's a physical tic with Tourette's or a habitual more complex habitual behavior to seek a drug that has just been hardwired through the habit learning process. But I came into it from that perspective, and so there was an addiction. I got funded by the National Institute on Drug Abuse. I've been a drug abuse researcher, and that's where so much of this has come from, because there's been such institutional bias, a pernicious kind of institutional bias, towards researching cannabis to figure out why it's wrong, why it's acutely dangerous, why it's dangerous in the long term. And even with that bias in place, out of that is the discovery of the endocannabinoid system. And with the endocannabinoid system, and we see how broadly useful it is for physiology and well-being, the endocannabinoid system has, in a sense, I like to say, has liberated cannabis from the drug abuse paradigm. Because social policy was never going to let, I mean, I shouldn't say never, but there was a tight lock on cannabis as only a drug of abuse. When I started getting into this field in the mid-90s, that's how young it is, mid-90s, I'm going into the field and going to neuroscience meetings and saying, but have you looked into the endocannabinoid system? Because cannabinoid receptors are in this brain area you're looking at. They mediate plasticity. Maybe it would be something to look at with your particular study, like Tourette syndrome. And the response I would get, and others in my field would get, was usually along the lines of, well, I don't study addiction. I don't study marijuana. I'm not interested in drug abuse, whatever. Because the institutional framework, the mindset wasn't there yet, that I'm not talking about addiction and brain damage and toxicity. I'm talking about an innate neural system, the most abundant receptors in our brain. All drugs and neurotransmitters and hormones work on cells through receptors. And in this kind of receptors, the so-called G protein coupled receptors, the cannabinoid receptor CB1 is the most abundantly expressed in the brain. It's all over the brain. And it leads to some ideas I have about the evolution of complex nervous systems in general. That the evolution of large complex brains in vertebrates, including humans, may have been enabled or facilitated in some way by the appearance in a prevertebrate ancestor of cannabinoid receptors like the ones we call CB1 and CB2 now. These things first appeared, our genetic studies indicate, in a fish-like animal at the base of the vertebrate tree of life. Before that, there were these lipids we now call endocannabinoids, but the receptors appeared in this sort of grandfather of the vertebrate family tree, and in a relatively short period of evolutionary time, you get this massive explosion of species, tremendously enlarged and complex and functional brains and cognitive brains in vertebrates, every area of which is teeming with cannabinoid receptors. And every brain area uses cannabinoids to fine-tune their inputs, to tweak their workings within a larger system to promote adaptive behavior. So maybe the endocannabinoid evolution was a drive to help support complex brains and adaptive immune systems, which is only found in vertebrate animals. Other animals don't have this like production of antibodies. If a snail receives a virus and is ill from it, they don't generate antibodies towards that virus. Vertebrates have that kind of adaptive or no, I'm blanking on the other term, but that kind of adaptive immune system. And the endocannabinoids are involved in that too. So I've got pretty big ideas about the evolutionary connection. Why does the cannabis genus have these phytocannabinoids, which, I mean, we're learning that other botanical products influence the endocannabinoid system. That's exciting. Exciting for herbal therapies, exciting just for other reasons. But when it comes to these particular molecules, THC, the cannabidiols, they're to date only found in the cannabis genus. What's it doing for that plant? And there's lots of great ideas out there. Helped protect the seeds from UV radiation. Maybe it just evolved as part of the sticky resin that helps to grab pollen in a wind-pollinated plant. Helps to deter herbivory or something. We don't really, and maybe we'll never know the ancestral condition of the cannabis plant. But the cannabis plant has absolutely clearly evolved under the influence of humans, of humankind. It evolved out of those sort of steppes of Central Asia and migrated around the globe because it was cherished by human beings, because it was useful for fiber, for food, for psychoactivity. And in those areas of, you know, the Chinese highlands where we have these archaeological finds now, it's clear that it was used shamanically. It was used for psychoactive function in cultures that then proceeded to spread it throughout Asia, into Africa, Europe, the world. So ecologists would say there's a mutualism, for sure, between humans and the cannabis plant. We have influenced the cannabis plant's evolution to develop these psychoactive properties, I think, these health-promoting properties. I think that's been selected for through humans. And it's a long enough deep time relationship, thousands of years, that, do we call that artificial selection because it was humans, or we call it natural selection because we're part of nature and we influence the plant in its sort of boutique of cannabinoids? It's fascinating. We don't know for sure. More controversial question is whether the plant influenced our evolution, and that's a very hard question, but it certainly benefited us, and so it's safe to say it's a very co-mutualistic relationship. And the reasons that the plant evolved the compounds in the first place may not be the reasons why the THC and the CBDs became so prominent. That may have been through its interaction with humans as a co-evolving species. There's definitely a concern there. Partly we know that, for example, the endocannabinoid system, and therefore the cannabinoid receptors that cannabis works on, play a role in the wiring up of neural systems properly. So just sort of on first principle, it makes perfect sense to think, well, now that we know that, isn't it risky to put young patients on that regimen? But it's not uncharted territory. There have been long-term prospective studies of kids exposed even in utero, mothers using cannabis, looking to see at neurocognitive outcomes in youth, adolescents. No real haymaker findings there. In fact, the earlier study, a study that was done in Ottawa, Peter Fried's group did this study, had a really interesting finding in the literature that the kids that had been exposed in utero, with funding that had been targeted at finding out how damaging is it, the kids that had been exposed in utero had higher neurocognitive performances when they looked at them at an adolescent time point. I don't remember the age. And they wrote that off they explained that with a turn of phrase called the Earth Mother effect, because they thought that if there was damage from the in utero exposure to cannabis, it was masked by the fact that the cannabis using population were very nurturing. And so it was the Earth Mother effect. But those kids continued to be followed prospectively. There wasn't the kind of sampling bias you get with a lot of studies. Some of them went on to smoke pot, some of them didn't, and they looked at studies with them, and still, IQ effects? No, not really. Present when they were heavy smokers, but not if they quit. William B. O'Shaughnessy, Irish physician who is credited with bringing Indian hemp, as he called it, back to Britain and became popular in the 19th century. He was one of the early Western physicians in experimenting with seizure conditions and tetanus. He applied cannabis extracts to individuals with tetanus, which had an almost 100% mortality at that time, and had a tremendous survival rate. More survived than didn't. Got them through that dangerous period, which is relevant today. Tetanus still occurs. But my point here is that among other things that he observed was that kids with different conditions, young children, could tolerate really kind of heroic doses of cannabis extracts without the same psychoactive, the same type of psychoactive effect that adults have, without getting stoned out, We don't understand all the reason for that. Part of that is because of a delay in the program for when these receptors get turned on. They're present in young people, but not everywhere. And anyway, it's an observation. So much of our understanding of the endocannabinoid system has come out of a drug abuse paradigm. And part of that drug abuse paradigm is the expectation, the preconceived understanding that cannabis is going to damage the brain, which has never really been based in a firm scientific grounding. And the Controlled Substance Act, that's the law of the land in the United States, that is propped up on a medical proposition that there's no medical utility and a significant, risk. That's never been on solid scientific grounding. It's kind of a house of cards in that way. The aspect of that says cannabis causes damage, so let's fund research to figure out what that damage looks like, pervades the whole story. And so you have, again, this sort of pernicious institutional bias towards finding damage. And so when with people like me who are neuroscientists who are quite interested in mechanism, I'm very interested to know if somebody smokes high-dose THC from early teenage years for 10 years, if it changes a part of the gray matter of the brain a little bit, I'm curious in that. But I shouldn't see that finding as necessarily indicating damage. It may indicate that the brain is working in a different way. And I don't think it should be a surprise that someone with a long-term cannabis habit may start to, or medical treatment, may start to employ different aspects of their brain a little bit differently. They're thinking a little bit differently. It's changed the way they think. And if there's some themes in the way cannabis changes the way you think, the way you approach problems, then over time, because the endocannabinoids are involved with structuring brain areas and their connections, you may see some of these structurally subtle changes. To infer them as damage has been done largely in the absence of impressive neurocognitive findings, Those findings that do seem to be replicated by some groups, in which there may be some traction, is something like a decrease in IQ, 5 to 6 points or something. Not every study has seen that, so why not? Maybe it's because of the different types of cannabis product being involved. But let's say you've got a pediatric patient who needs to take high-dose cannabinoids. If it's cannabidiol based, we don't really have a basis to say that's going to damage the brain. There's no real solid evidence to say that at all. If it's a highly THC based thing, maybe with chronic use to get through that illness or to manage it, you could be seeing neurocognitive changes that manifest as some sort of deficit in IQ, a deficit that's largely within the realm of error of IQ tests. The notion that that is more dangerous, more threatening to a parent than the disease itself, cancer, your life on the line, 100, 200 seizures a day, there's no doubt that's got serious brain developmental problems. The notion that the risk of long-term cannabis use would eclipse that is just, it's unthinkable to me. It's really unthinkable. You see a lot of scientific literature that labels euphoria as a negative side effect. It's part of the negative connotation of getting high, but that term refers to an elevation of mood. Someone who's depressed, for whatever different reasons, elevating, lifting up to a higher place, your mood, is what you're after. You're not just there to cope, you're there to get to a better place. Yeah, who knows? I've heard it said, yeah, our sort of puritanical upbringing is part of it, and my grandparents' generation is the kind of, slug through it, just take what life deals you, and take the medicines that the doctor gives. Hey, Grandma, what are you taking? I don't know. It's what the doctor told me to take. The cannabis is what I think is a vanguard of a holistic botanical medical approach, resurgence, so to speak. I think includes the notion of people being conscious of their own healthcare choices. What is it? I love being an educator and asking and having people ask, what does it mean for cannabis to be useful? I don't know all the answers, but that's the question that people should be asking, and it shouldn't be draped in so much scientific and biomedical jargon that it's utterly inaccessible. And viewing the endocannabinoid system as a system of homeostasis and well-being, something that evolutionarily has created imparted resilience to neural systems and to other aspects of our physiology is a way, I think, to relate to your own medicine. Because you're relating to your body, and you're relating to the body of the plant, and our common, presence in the real time, shared space, and in deep ancestral time of having common ancestry and having evolved in relationship to one another, if that makes sense. It's fun to think about.